Hello, and welcome back to the second session in our extended reality lecture series, where we will talk about the physiological aspects of human-computer interaction. Last time, we ended the session with interaction as being one of the criteria for determining where we are along the virtuality continuum. However, today we will try to dive deeper into the interaction segment as one of the human-computer interaction portions of our exploration. So when we try to define what interaction is, we can always go to the Webster's dictionary, which defines interaction as mutual or reciprocal action or influence. However, if we try to find similar interpretations of the word interaction, we can find stuff like the folk notion that interaction is two entities engaged in interplay of sorts. If we dive deeper, we can see that different books such as Interaction Design, Designing for Interaction, Strategies for Effective Human-Computer Interaction, Handbook of Human-Computer Interaction, and so on, offer different interpretations and different views of what interaction is. This all leads us to believe that interaction has to be defined in scopes of the context that we are looking at. So in order to answer the question what interaction is, we can revert back to the Webster's dictionary definition, where it specifies that it is mutual or reciprocal action or influence. The word action is important here, and we can use that as the starting point of our exploration and put it in the context of Don Norman's action cycle, which was introduced back in 1987-88 book, The Psychology of Everyday Things, which was later republished as The Design of Everyday Things in 2013. In it, Don Norman specifies that there are two distinct things, like the goal on one side and the world on the other, and the evaluation and execution phases in between, both having reflective, behavioral, and visceral parts among them. So the real question is, do we first observe the world, and once we do, define what our goal is, or do we first have a goal and then do something and see how it impacts the world around us? In order to explore this, we can take a look at this example where we want to read a book, but it's too dark. So our goal is to have more light so we can read the book. And the first stage is the planning stage, or figuring out what actions we can do to solve this problem. So we can call someone else to turn on the light. We can turn on the light. We can wait for the conditions outside to be brighter, and so on. So we plan for all these actions, and then we have to specify which action we would like to do. So we will turn the lights on ourselves. And then we perform the action. With plan, specify, and perform, we have successfully completed the execution phase of the Don Norman action cycle. And afterwards, we observe how our action and how our performance of an action has influenced the world around us. So once we observe the world around us, we can see that the light is on. We can interpret how that is seen in the scope of our goal, and then we can compare how the previous state compares to the current one, so we can see if the goal is executed. This stage, where we have the perceive, interpret, and compare part, is called the evaluation part. So basically it has 7 steps. However, it only comes down to 3. So having a goal, performing an action or executing an action, and evaluating the world around us after it's been done. So the real question about the goal and the world is still there, especially when viewed through the scope of the virtual reality application. So usually when we are in a game or within a architectural space, we first observe what is happening around us, and then we determine what we would like our goal to be. For example, it's too dark, we want to see if we can turn on the light, or something is happening in one part of the room, and we make our goal based on the happenings there. Usually the main goal is to solve something or explore something, but it comes down to our perception of the world. So the question between goal and world still exists, but we will focus more on the evaluation part of the world, since that's an important notion wherever we put our attention to. And it all starts with stimuli. So stimuli can be interpreted in different ways. It's basically something that engages our receptors or our senses. It can be seen with plants, with people, animals, whatever, but it's a broad topic, and we will just look at it from the scope of the reality virtuality continuum and our physiological needs in this case. So the first is the distal stimuli. That's a stimuli, or that's an event that happens far away from us, but that does not reach our senses. So when they say if a tree falls in the woods, does it make a sound? If we are talking in philosophical terms, then we can talk about whether this sound exists if we don't hear it and so on. However, objectively, the tree does make a sound, and if it doesn't reach us, it's called a distal stimuli. So there is a certain amount of energy that's being released. We can feel the shock value of this when it falls down. We can hear it, we can see it if we are there. But if we are not, all that energy is dissipated and doesn't reach our senses. When we observe this through the scope of virtual reality, we can take a look that the reality we are observing is the one that's being rendered. However, everything else around us is not there because it does not need to be there. It requires further processing power of the computer and so on. So the distal stimuli in virtual reality is not cost effective and hence does not happen. So only things that happen are the ones that should reach our senses. If something is happening and it's not being observed by us, it's not cost effective for the computer and for the rendering in real time. So we specified that the proximal stimuli is the distal stimuli that actually reaches our senses. The most basic example of that is if we observe a tree. So the tree reflects light off of it. If that light reaches our receptors in the eye, we can say that that's a proximal stimuli. And with the stimuli, the distant and the proximal, we have to introduce the term of the physiology, or our own body and how it interprets these proximal stimuli that arrive. So when the stimuli reaches our senses, we can say that the sensation has occurred. So our receptors were activated by the proximal stimuli, and the nerves guided the impulse to our brain. Once the impulse reaches our brain and starts to make sense of it, then we are talking about perception. So the perception part involves the interpretation by the brain, and the sensation is only the event where the senses are activated by the proximal stimuli or the energy of the proximal stimuli. So a sound wave reaching our ear, light reaching our eyes, pheromones reaching our receptors in the nose, smell receptors in the nose, and so on. And an interesting story about sensation and perception can be seen in the case of Oliver Sacks, who is suffering from a disease that's called prosopagnosia. So that means that Oliver is not able to distinguish faces. So the sensation part works where the proximal stimuli reaches his eye, activates the senses, reaches the brain. However, the brain does not work properly or does not perceive these faces because the facial recognition area is not working properly. So that means that he can observe a friend he talked to 1 minute ago and not perceive him as the friend until he hears his voice. So when talking about all these three important aspects, the Norman action cycle, the stimuli, and the physiology, then we can talk about the cycle that's been mentioned here in the VR book, the Human-Centered Design for Virtual Reality, where we have the connection for the stimuli, physiology, and behavior in this case. So the stimuli can be proximal and distal. The physiology mostly refers to the processing and the receptors, and the behavior is connected to perception and our own action. And you can see that the stimuli influences both behavior and physiology, even though it seems that the receptors or the sensation part needs to influence the perception and not the other way around. So what is happening here? Perhaps the best way to explore this is through a thought experiment that was introduced by Frank Jackson in 1982 in his article, The Epiphenomenal Qualia, which was dubbed Mary's Room, as shown here in the TED Ed video, A Philosophical Thought Experiment by Eleanor Nelson. So in this story, or in this example about qualia, we follow Mary, who is a neuroscientist and who lives in a black and white room, who reads black and white books, and whose computer only shows black and white images. So she understands every physical aspect of how we perceive color. So even though she lives in a black and white world, she knows everything about color, knows everything about light, how it reaches our receptors, how it activates it, how the impulse travels throughout the nerves, through the brain, where it's perceived, how the perception happens, and so on. So one day, while working on her computer, the computer malfunctions and it shows an image of a red apple. So the question is now posed, does Mary have new information in her brain? So to dial it back, we know that she understands everything about this, how it's shown, how the impulses activate certain portions of the brain, and so on. But the real question is, does she have new information? If we consider that experience is a form of new information, then we are introducing something that's called qualia, which is determined or defined as subjective qualities that cannot be described or measured. So that means that even though you can physically and objectively describe everything that happens around you, the personal experience is something that's subjective and that cannot be described, and hence we can claim that Mary did receive new information in this thought experiment. So if we take a look at the circle regarding the stimuli, physiology, and the action, we can make it more complex by taking every part of that group apart and putting it in a circle like this, where we introduce the topics of top-down and bottom-up approach, or the top-down and bottom-up knowledge in reference to the perception and the processing. So in one case, we start off with the stimuli, distal stimuli, that becomes proximal stimuli. Through this process, it reaches our senses and it's being processed, and then we perceive something, and once we perceive something like observing the world, we can form a goal and do the entire action process as we talked about. So when we do it in this way, we are talking about a bottom-up approach. So where we go from sensation to perception to formulating an action accordingly. However, if we're talking about a top-down approach, we are talking about already knowing something or have certain memory and perception about something, and then anticipating what you might feel and how the sensation would be. So if you see a red apple, for example, on the table, you can already know how light it will be before you pick it up. So you anticipate what the sensation will be based on your perception and based on prior experiences you might have. So for example, if you take the controller in VR and you pick up this bowling pin, you can, based on your prior knowledge, you can have your perception if this is light, and then when you pick it up, you know what to expect. On the other hand, if there are no scale down movements, when you pick up the bust that you can see here, you can expect it to be more heavy, but since you're only lifting air or holding the controller, that sense is kind of lost. So what do they do in this example? They scale down your movement. So if you're moving 2 centimeters, for example, with the controller, they only move the bust by 1 centimeter, thus showcasing you that as you're moving, the element you are moving is moving slower. And in that case, it's inducing a sense of weight, even though you are not basically lifting anything. So that's only one example of how the normal action cycle and the stimuli and the physiology we have regarding sensation and perception can be guided or manipulated so you can have certain experiences and senses that you would like to introduce in the VR environment and alongside the extended reality continuum. With this example, I would like to conclude this session and invite you to explore other topics that might deal with photorealistic approach when it comes to geometry and modeling in VR. Thank you for your attention, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.